The housing market's wild here. It's getting so expensive.
Inflation is terrifying to me.
Inflation is a big issue for me.
Well, inflation is my top issue.
Inflation is really high.
I want the state to work on mental health.
Political reform.
The war over in Europe.
How and where tax dollars get spent.
Property taxes are going up, but unfortunately, pay raises aren't.
It's one of the biggest questions politicians, journalists, and pollsters are trying to answer every election year. What do voters actually care about?
Immigration, climate change, the economy. Do different people have different priorities, or are voters more alike than we might think?
To answer that question, Sean and I packed our day bags and hit the open road to find out what's on the top of Utahns' minds this election season. I'm Sage Miller.
And I'm Sean Higgins. This week on State Street, what Utah voters really care about. We talk to members of the public to get their thoughts on some pressing issues.
And we compare what we heard with what pollsters are seeing in their data.
First stop on our road trip was Brigham City in Box Elder County.
Home to the best peaches, the world's greatest wild bird refuge, and lots of farms.
Yep. Sage, you and I both live in Salt Lake City. We have a pretty good idea of what people are talking about here, but that could be totally different than what people are worried about just an hour drive up I-15.
We parked right next to the Brigham City Arch along Main Street and started walking on a quiet morning.
We couldn't have picked a better day. Sunny with just a hint of fall in the air. Main Street is an eclectic mix of shops and restaurants. There's a local paper right around the corner and a ton of small town character.
We stopped by a local coffee shop right between a florist and a cafe. That's where we met Amber Bignow. She's 41 and has lived in Brigham City pretty much her whole life. And she said the city has evolved a lot since she was a kid. Now she works 3 jobs just to make ends meet.
Inflation is terrifying to me, and the cost of living is definitely going up here in town. Our taxes were just recently raised. Property taxes are going up, but unfortunately, pay raises aren't. And so people are definitely suffering. I know that people are barely scraping to get by, and small businesses are being affected. The luxuries that people used to be able to go splurge on are fewer and fewer. I know that I've cut down on a lot of things that used to bring me joy just because I'm worried, and I want to make sure that I have something possibly saved in case something would happen. It's terrifying.
You know, putting aside that afternoon pick-me-up treat or Target run or quick weekend getaway really sucks.
Amber was also concerned about housing in Brigham City. She said that just like the Wasatch Front, the market is bonkers there too, even if you don't hear much news about it.
We met Raymond Trujillo at a fruit stand on Utah's famous Fruitway along Old Highway 89, where we were all shopping for Brigham City's tasty peaches. He's recently retired and is also worried about housing. He told us he feels stuck.
People just can't afford to get into new homes, and even just the rent is very expensive. And then they're going up all over, so I couldn't afford a new apartment. You know, it's $1,900. My mortgage is $1,100, and it was above the apartment rentals. But now it's just the reverse. You know, so unless you're buying a brand new home, and I don't know how people do that these days. I just recently tried, but we couldn't afford a $400,000 home. I don't know how other people do it.
What Raymond and Amber said about housing and inflation, we heard that from Brigham City all the way down to Provo.
After cruising down Fruitway, we hopped back on the interstate and headed south to another famous Brigham in Utah. We hit up good old Brigham Young University for the student perspective, and it sounded super familiar.
BYU is gorgeous, by the way. It feels like you can reach out and touch the mountains right from the student center, which is where we found Derek White. He's a student at BYU, and he said he and his wife are worried about money too.
Inflation is a big issue for me. I think that's one of the big ones that impacts my life and my family. Well, certainly we see grocery prices go up. The gas prices are trending up too. I know they're going down over the past few months, which is nice. But grocery prices are they're the biggest one.
People also have other concerns. We heard about the drought, medical marijuana access, the war in Ukraine, and the national deficit. And 3 people said they vote just because they think it's the right thing to do, like Provo resident Washington C. Pierce.
I believe that it is important to be civically engaged, fundamentally.
And we didn't stop there. We also made a point to talk with people in Salt Lake City. We heard more concerns about housing at the Capitol, but there was also another issue that popped up: climate change. At the 9th Street Festival in Salt Lake, Troy Anderson said he's looking for politicians to tackle issues like the drought and how fast the Salt Lake area is growing.
So for sure, I would say climate change, definitely, especially with the lake drying up and air quality issues in the valley. I would definitely say zoning issues with like how we build our cities would definitely be another problem. I would be looking for somebody who pushes for more, I guess, equal building for housing problems. Honestly, that's my main two, is like, if they can't really get behind things that address those issues, I can't get behind them really.
We heard a lot of things, but 2 main issues popped up over and over again: inflation and housing.
It's not cool.
Turns out,
it's the economy, stupid.
we're going to take a quick break. When we're back, we'll compare what we heard on the street to what polling experts are hearing. You're listening to State Street.
Support for State Street comes from the Hinckley Report podcast, a weekly roundtable discussion about the biggest political headlines in the Beehive State. Find new episodes of PBS Utah's The Hinckley Report every Friday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Listeners can hear KUER on the radio across Utah. Beyond the dial, there are many ways to stay connected to NPR Utah. Enjoy our free live stream at KUER.org. Take us wherever you go with the KUER mobile app. And if you have a smart speaker, find us there, too, by saying Play KUER. Explore all the ways to stay connected at KUER.org/listen.
You're listening to State Street. I'm Sage Miller.
And I'm Sean Higgins. So, voters had a lot to say on our road trip, but there were definitely some common threads like the economy and the housing market.
No matter how hard people try, they just can't run away from higher gas and food prices. Add the increase in housing on top of that, and you got yourself a recipe for something a lot less appetizing than Jell-O salad.
Gross, Sage. So how do we know if we're speaking to the right people? Did we get a good representation of what voters in Utah really care about? Or were we just hearing what people thought we wanted to hear?
Lucky for us, Sean, there are some people who work very hard to keep a finger on the pulse of what Utahns care about, namely the Hinckley Institute. And yeah, you just heard a promo for them. But we called them because every month they partner with the Deseret News to poll people across the state on these issues. I asked Director Jason Perry and Associate Director Morgan Lyon-Cotty if we're picking up what they're putting down.
So the economy is always a top issue for voters, especially when there's stressors on that economy. And inflation is a huge stressor for people. We polled on this in September and found that 96% of Utahns are concerned about inflation. And I don't know any other issue where we see that kind of uniformity of thought. And the November election is sandwiched between these moments in people's lives. There's the summer vacations and back to school, which can stress wallets. And then people are thinking ahead to the holidays and how they're going to afford those. And inflation makes that even more stressful. And those thoughts weigh heavily on voters' minds as they go to the ballot box.
And Morgan, based off this polling, because I know it's a recent report, and aside from the economy, what's also on the tops of Utahns' heads as they head to the ballot box this election cycle?
You know, economy across the board, for most of those demographic groups and party members, it's really important. And then interestingly, in September, a lot of voters are interested and taking note of the role of the federal government. And that's usually people who, if you're thinking about it, it's usually because it's a negative. It's usually because they're frustrated and they're worried about, is the federal government playing its proper role? Is it doing enough? Is it doing too much? And these are the things that are on voters' minds, especially when they're thinking about voting for Congress and Senate.
So it's so interesting where you see this one rising, because we've done polling in the past where the proper role of the federal government has not really been the highest on the list. It's number 2 on our most recent polling, which is interesting. I mean, I'm kind of looking at this issue and thinking people are saying, well, maybe, we got the Supreme Court making decisions about abortion, for example, which is also high on people's minds. And they start looking at some of these decisions that are being made. And all of a sudden it goes back to these historical, we used to be arguing mostly with the Republicans saying, don't want the federal government in my business. Their job is to stay off my back and out of my wallet, something like that. But it's become on both sides of the aisle now an issue people are thinking about again.
Something that I'm kind of curious about is that we had some different answers based off where we were in the state. So does this polling differ based on location? Is the Salt Lake County voter different from the San Juan County voter, for example?
There are issues that are just important in rural Utah that you see more than here. And I think that's a little bit why our congressional districts are drawn the way that they are, to make sure that we're thinking about those rural districts. At least some think that's the case. But you start talking about water. We're all talking about that now. But you start talking about public lands, for example. You start talking about grazing. You start talking about the ability to make some kind of a living off of the lands in rural Utah. Those are high on their list. And that's why you see some of the even legislators out there making protests about the federal government, particularly when it comes to public lands.
Can you kind of just give me a rundown of what this polling says of what is on the top of Utahns' minds?
So economy is always high. People are thinking about the federal government. Interestingly, some of those issues that are so prominent in the news are not as high. Immigration is near the bottom of the list for people. And if you're watching the news, it makes you think that that is the number one issue for voters. And also, a difference we saw between the genders was that overall and with men, abortion was pretty low on the list. But for women, it was tied for second. So that's really interesting that women have that on the mind. They're thinking about that Dobbs case and the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and it will impact how they vote in November.
I was going to say, what's interesting about not just this poll, but every poll, really the numbers are part of the story, but the most important part of the story is what's behind those numbers. And every one of these things that people put as a priority has a different percentage if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or even what kind of Republican or Democrat you are, or what your gender is that you identify with. All of these things change this priority list. We're giving you the overall numbers, but really breaking down these numbers based on these kind of demographics really gives you a pretty interesting picture about what every individual category of people and demographic thinks about the priorities.
What are some other issues that are coming up?
So voters are still concerned about health care, but it's interesting. Now it's tied for third for voters in Utah, whereas in 2018, that was a major issue. And it's what a lot of people credit for the Democrats having such a good midterm year. They really hammered home on those healthcare issues and how they were the party that would help voters out. And this time, it's just not as prominent in voters' minds. It may be because Affordable Care Act is more in the distance. They're trying to move on from COVID, but it's just not as top of mind anymore.
What about the environment and climate change? With air quality, the ongoing mega drought in the state of Utah, is that something that Utahns are concerned about, or is that kind of isolated in different pockets around the state?
Well, I'll give two parts to this. One, and I'll break up these questions a little bit, because the environment was high on the list. It's about 10% of Utahns is what we're looking at. Say this is one of their top priorities. But we asked separate questions based on water, as you just talked about, like the Great Salt Lake, for example, and about the drought. And I will tell you, there isn't almost any person in the state of Utah that doesn't have an opinion about that. And they're all concerned. We asked them that question, how concerned are you about the Great Salt Lake? And it's almost everyone. Every particular demographic in the state of Utah is concerned about that. And that's connected to the overall water. And I think that's a guide for our policymakers as well, as they're looking at something like this saying, well, Utahns want us to address the water issues. And as we know, those water issues are very much tied to the environmental issues.
And Morgan, there's been a lot of hesitancy surrounding polling data, and in recent election seasons, some polling has been way off. The 2016 presidential election, the 2018 midterms. What's the process that y'all use to measure what Utahns care about?
One of the nice things about our polling is that we poll just about every month. And so that makes it so we have our fingers on the pulse of Utah, and we can see, are things moving? And that also helps us judge whether it's a good poll. If numbers are too far off from the previous month, then we have literally gone back into the field for another week or two to get a few more hundred survey respondents so we can make sure we have this good data. So we think about these questions really carefully, really critically. We make sure we have a good demographic profile. And then we also recognize that there's an art form to polling, and it really is a capture of a moment in time. You have to be careful with how much predictive power you give polling and understand that it is, again, just sort of the picture of what Utahns are thinking about at that moment that you're polling.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time.
So it sounds like we were actually pretty on the nose when it comes to what's on people's minds right now.
Nailed it. But something I didn't expect was how high people ranked the role of the federal government in their voting decisions.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, though. The federal government is trying to take steps to fight inflation, and the Supreme Court is making decisions that affect millions of people's reproductive health.
And many of the voters who have had enough of the federal government, like when it comes to abortion, were women.
That was a very interesting breakdown in how men and women prioritize that issue. I'm really curious how that plays out.
And Republicans feel the same about the federal government, but on different issues, like how much they pay in taxes and what it's being spent on.
I also thought it was thought-provoking how few people prioritize the environment in broad terms, but how many people say the shrinking Great Salt Lake is an issue they really care about.
And pretty much every congressional campaign I've seen is at least talking about inflation and the skyrocketing cost of housing.
Yeah, people on both sides of the political spectrum recognize this as a problem right now.
All this to say, voters are complicated. While we found common threads, like inflation, it wasn't the only thing stressing them out.
Different people care about different things. What does matter is how they prioritize those things.
And polls are just a snapshot of what people care about at a specific time. Successful road trip, Sean?
Successful road trip. That does it for this episode of State Street. I'm Sean Higgins.
And I'm Sage Miller. Our executive producer is Caroline Ballard. Editorial and production support comes from Elaine Clark and David Childs.
We have digital support from Jim Hill, Raquel Davis, Renee Bright, and Eleanor Gomberg. State Street is a production of KUER.
If you liked what you heard, be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. It helps other listeners find the show.
Next week, we're breaking down the U.S. Senate race between incumbent Mike Lee and independent Evan McMullen. See you then.
From KUER.